Yes.
May I announce that I have appearing with me today Ms O'Neill and Ms Bowe for the Walker Lane families.
Sorry.
Ms O'Neill of Council is also appearing today,
Thank you.
and she'll be taking some of the witnesses this week.
Thank you very much.
I should also announce my appearance for the Brown family. Moreau appearing for the Brown family this week. Mr Mullins was appearing last week.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. I call Assistant Commissioner Travis Worst. Assistant Commissioner, do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
I do.
Thank you. So could you please tell the court your full name, your rank and where you're currently stationed?
Assistant Commissioner Travis James Worst. I'm currently the Assistant Commissioner responsible for the service area of Greater Darwin Road Safety and Support. I'm based out of Darwin.
You've provided a number of documents and attachments, interviews and attachments and statements that assist Her Honour. I'll just name them onto the record. There's an interview that you participated in on the 5th of December 2019, which is found, Your Honour, in the brief of evidence at 7-144 with various attachments, and a statement on the 20th of August 2020 at 7145 with various attachments. Assistant Commissioner, at the time that you participated in your interview on the 5th of December 2019, just a month after Kumanjayi passed, your substantive rank was that of Commander, is that right?
Correct.
What was your substantive position at that time?
So at that time I was the Commander and responsible for Darwin Command.
Why was it that you came to be involved effectively in some decision making on the night of the 9th, or I withdraw that, on the day and night of the 9th of November 2019?
So in October of 2019, the Commissioner Kershaw had moved to another role, and as a consequence, Deputy Commissioner Murphy was acting as the Commissioner of Police, and Assistant Commissioner Narelle Beer, who was responsible for remote and regional policing, or remote and road safety as it was called then, was acting as the Deputy Commissioner, and I fulfilled her role for a number of months in Alice Springs.
I'll come to your decision-making and assistance that you gave on the 9th of November shortly. Before I do, can I ask you firstly about your history in the Northern Territory Police? I appreciate that you've set this out previously in your statements, but particularly for those watching, it's important to understand your background. You started as a police officer, I think, in Alice Springs on the 12th of December 1995, is that right?
Correct.
Where did you do your training in the lead up to starting as a police officer?
So I started my training on the 3rd of July 1995, and that was conducted at the Police College, which is based in Darwin at the Peter McCauley Centre.
Do you recall, as part of your training, having any advice or instruction about cultural competency?
There was some during my training. I do recall as a part of that going to Bachelor and undertaking some cross-cultural type awareness, but it's not as extensive as it is now for police recruits.
Did you grow up in the Northern Territory?
No, I did not. I come off a farming property in country South Australia, and then I moved here when I was 19.
So your career has always been in policing, is that right?
Ostensibly my career has been policing in the Northern Territory, yes.
What was it that attracted you to the role?
Well, I'd always wanted to be a police officer. We travelled as a family up here when I was 15. To use the romantic term, I fell in love with the place was true. I applied for the police when I was 19, was accepted, and joined, as I said before. I was sworn in the day before I turned 20 as a 19-year-old.
So, forgive me for being blunt, Assistant Commissioner. Can you tell us now your age?
I'm 47.
So you're able to then provide us with some reflections of your time in Territory Police from when you were a young man, 19 or 20, until you're working your way up effectively from probationary constable to Assistant Commissioner.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you about your experience in bush communities. You told us that you started in Alice Springs in 1995, and your first relief duties, you explain in your interview and statement, were at Yuendamu between 28th of May and the 31st of July 1996, correct?
Correct, yes.
You were leaving then at Papania Police Station from February 1997 until June 1997.
Correct, yes.
And you had a permanent position at Yuendamu from the 1st of March 1998, and you worked at that station until May 1999.
Correct.
That was your first experience of policing in community, is that right?
Yes.
So I'll just ask you for your reflections about Yuendamu in 1998 when you were stationed, or 1997-98 when you were stationed there permanently. Do you recall how many police officers were there at the time?
So in 1998, so 1997 when I was at Papania, that was a sergeant and 2 constables, and at Yuendamu in 1998, that was a sergeant, 2 constables, and we had an Aboriginal community police officer at times as well.
I think the Aboriginal community police officer that you have worked with, 2 Aboriginal community police officers at that time, is that right?
Yes, the one was there permanently, and another moved between Yuendamu and Kintor at the time. Both of those men have since passed away.
So I won't ask you to say their names if that's culturally inappropriate or at the risk of being culturally inappropriate, but can you tell us about your relationship with the ACPOs as a young officer when they were there?
They were instrumental in providing me an understanding, a cultural understanding of the community that they were a part of. Both of them were senior Walpri men in their own right, as well as holding the leadership position within the Northern Territory Police. They were able to integrate me into that community so that I had an understanding of what was and was not appropriate and the way in which I should and should not communicate with people and how it should occur. I also was given the opportunity to understand where I should and should not go in that community from a cultural appropriateness point of view. And those 2 men both became, and their families, I became close with. To the extent that I became their friends, and I actually went to both their funerals. One man was buried at Kintor and the other was buried at Nirrupi, and I actually took my family to the funeral at Nirrupi.
When you were learning from those men about, you said part of it included what was and was not appropriate. Can you give us some examples of that?
Body language, eye contact, skin group relationships, the marriage protocols, sensitivities around ceremonies, the relationship between men and women within the community. And look, although they explained lots of information to me, it was extremely complex, and I must say I, to this day, still don't understand much or all of it, but it gave me enough information to know that when I had a question, I knew where to go to answer or get an answer to that particular question.
In that respect, one of the places you would go to would be your ACPOs, obviously, to get an answer to questions. Did you also come to know elders in the community who you could ask for advice from?
Look, very much so. I became familiar with both men and women who held senior Walpri leadership positions within the community, and that wasn't just the elder individuals in the community, some of the younger people as well, who were then, when I was there, emerging leaders, one of whom is now an Aboriginal community police officer himself and is a Walpri leader, that's Derek Williams. I knew not just within the Yuendamu community, but also in other communities, Nirrupi, Willara, Laramba, Lajamanu, who the leaders within those communities were, and how to negotiate my way through some of the sensitivities that may occur in our daily business.
In terms of dealing with conflict that might arise in the community, did you ever go to elders or emerging leaders to assist you in that regard?
Regularly. The same applied for when I was at Papania as well.
When you were in the community in 1998, do you recall that the Mount Theo program was operating?
It was. I'm not entirely sure of its actual name, but I will refer to it as the Mount Theo program. It was a program that was designed around supporting young people who were affected by or engaging in petrochemical abuse, petrol sniffing, to use the vernacular.
Just going back a step, we know that the population of Yuendamu currently fluctuates, but is somewhere between 800 to 900 people. Do you recall what the population was when you were there?
It ebbed and flowed from probably 500 to 1,000.
You've just mentioned petrochemicals. During the period of time you were at Yuendamu in 97, 98, was petrol sniffing a problem for the community, for some community members?
So when I was at Papunya, it was a significant issue, and that was 97. There was, in 98, 99, there was substance abuse there that related to petrol sniffing within the community, particularly within a cohort of young men. There was the occasional young woman and occasionally an adult male, but it was an issue that confounded that community whilst I was there, yes.
What about alcohol?
The trafficking of alcohol from legitimate locations where it could be purchased was a significant problem. We would spend a lot of our time in efforts to interdict, to prevent alcohol from reaching the community. And unfortunately, when we were unable to do so, which happened regularly, we would then have to deal with the aftermath of alcohol within that community, and that would manifest itself in many and very different ways.
It might sound like an obvious question, but from a policing perspective, what were the issues when you had an influx of alcohol in the community?
It could lead to violence, particularly domestic violence. It was an enabler for conflict at times between community groups. People would drive motor vehicles under the influence of alcohol, which created additional risk. It caused dysfunction in relation to getting people to work or getting young people to school. And it happened in the community relatively regularly in my time whilst there.
Was night patrol in operation at any time you were there?
Yes, there was a night patrol, and the men and I believe a couple of women who were involved in that have all since passed. It was a functioning entity, but not regular in its support to the community.
When it was operating and supportive of the community, was it of assistance to police?
Look, it was. They would share information with us. We would likewise do the same, and that would allow us to work together to try and manage whatever the particular scenario was at that point in time.
It stands to reason, doesn't it, if you've got elders and emerging leaders who are assisting police to stop the substance abuse, that is an effective way of helping the community?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just ask you about Mount Theo again. Do you recall the work of Andrew Stojnovski?
Yes.
Sometimes known or otherwise known as Yakajiri or Feathers?
Correct, yes.
He was there when you were working there as a police officer?
He was.
Can you tell Her Honour about the relationship between police and Yakajiri?
So Andrew was, I don't exactly know what his role was, but other than to recall that he was involved in the Mount Theo program. And we had a relationship with Andrew that I would describe as positive. He was a passionate individual that was there for the betterment of the community. We used to use his services to bail young men, predominantly for memory, to him to take to Mount Theo to give them the opportunity to be rehabilitated away from the petrol sniffing abuse that the cycle they were stuck in at that point in time.
And did you ever go and visit Mount Theo?
I did. Constable Hand and I drove to Mount Theo on at least one occasion, possibly two, and I do recall on one occasion going and spending time with all the young young men who were there, who were on bail, to have the opportunity to speak to them about why they were there in a point in time when there was clarity, because they weren't affected by petrol at that point in time.
So do you recall that as a positive interaction?
Absolutely, yeah, it certainly was. It was certainly positive in relation to not just the engagement involving Andrew and the young people, but also in relation to the two elders who were responsible for that particular outstation. For context, Mount Theo is north of Chillerwell. It's about 150 k's northwest up the Tanami from Yuendamu and about 100 kilometres in to the desert area. It's a traditional country was managed by the two elders that were there, one of whom since passed away, and the other, I believe, is still alive and lives in Yuendamu now.
And you're referring to Peggy Brown?
I am, yes.
You described there and going out there with Senior Constable Chris Hand, as he is now. You worked with Officer Hand when you were at Yuendamu?
Yes. So Chris Hand and I both went through training together, and then we worked together in Alice Springs and then at Yuendamu.
So what was your relationship like with Officer Hand when you were there?
It was fantastic. So Chris and I, we had a sergeant who was promoted to Yuendamu, and he was more administrative based within the police station. Chris and I did all the community work, all the community engagement, and we worked extremely well together.
Do you recall times in the community where you were understaffed or under-resourced because of various incidents?
Well, at times we might have only had a staff member, I'd say 2 staff members as opposed to 3. At times I did operate by myself or with the Aboriginal community police officer who was there, because either the sergeant or Chris may not have been available. When one of us would go on leave, someone would relieve from Alice Springs generally. So to suggest it was understaffed, it was the operating environment within which we did our job.
During that period of time, I'm sticking still with 1997-98, were there any periods of significant conflict in the community that were difficult?
So in 1998, soon after I started, there was a period of conflict that lasted about 6 weeks, that started about within the first week of my arrival. And that conflict involved numerous family groups. I'm not entirely sure how it started, but it did. It had a long-term legacy within the Warlpiri community, but it was sparked by a football match that occurred, and that culminated in lots of different instances of violence that occurred over a number of weeks at various times throughout the community. On multiple occasions, people were injured, and during those conflicts that happened in various locations across the community, some of which we were involved in and were called to, and others that occurred without our knowledge until post the event.
And in terms of the ones that you were called to, how were they managed by police?
Very, very difficult because of the number of people who were involved, the number of police that were there. It was 2 or 3 of us, possibly 4. We did not expect the Aboriginal community police officer to be involved in that type of scenario because of the cultural responsibilities that person also held. But I do recall trying to take weapons off people, trying to quell angry crowds, trying to manage at times hundreds of people who were all armed with various weapons. It was almost impossible for 3 people without placing ourselves at danger. Our priority was more around children within those groups who got caught up in the conflicts, and tried to manage them out of those scenarios. When I talked about weapons, it wasn't just simply traditional weapons. At times, the community would use other weapons: hammers, axes, knives, machetes, pieces of steel.
There are a number of firearms used for hunting purposes, is that right, by community members?
Yes.
Is it fair to say, however, that it's not usual that a police officer would be confronted by a gun being wielded by a community member?
In community, it's only happened to me on the one occasion, and that occurred at Papunya, where I was, someone brandished a firearm at me whilst under the influence of petrol. It didn't happen to me whilst I was at Yuendamu, but I'm aware it has happened at Yuendamu on other occasions.
Can I just stay with that time in Papunya then? So that was at some stage in 1997, is that right?
Correct.
Can you tell Her Honour what happened in that incident?
Myself and my partner then, who's now retired, Acting Sergeant Glennis Green, were called to a disturbance that was near a particular community leader's house. And as we were approaching that house, I saw something that looked unusual in the darkness, and when I shone a light, I could see that this young person had a firearm pointed at Glennis and I. I turned the light off and told Glennis to run. Glennis ran left, and I ran right and ran around behind him and tackled him. The individual was actually a young man who had no sensory ability to hear or see. To hear. He could see. He was deaf.
And so you understood his actions to be a product of his petrol sniffing? And
look, I'm not entirely sure, but he was certainly under the influence of petrol at that point in time.
it stands to reason, doesn't it, that when you're under the effect of that substance, you might act in a way that's irrational?
That's certainly my experience. So people, when they were not under the influence, would act completely differently if they were under the influence of petrol. Some of the behaviours of some of the young men who were kind and gentle people, when not under the influence, they were very different when they're under the influence of petrol, unfortunately.
At any time when you were working in community, did you ever draw your firearm?
No, but I had been with Chris, who did on one occasion, but I respectfully told him to put the firearm away very quickly, and we dealt with the scenario without the need for the use of a firearm.
Did you ever draw your taser, or were tasers in existence at that time?
They weren't a thing back then.
And capsicum spray, was that a thing?
No.
So at that stage when you're policing in community, you don't have many non-lethal weapons apart from using your voice commands.
Correct.
And tactical retreat and a baton, I suppose.
That's correct. They were the extent of our tactical options, yes.
At that time when you're in a community, you're still a young man in your early 20s. Did you feel that time in community was important to you in developing your communication skills?
Oh, absolutely. I learnt how to communicate appropriately at a level that was designed for maximum effect. I had to disarm a situation, a crowd, or an entity, an individual. I learnt how to listen. I also learnt, and when I did my first stint at Yundamu in 1996, the sergeant at the time, I think I'm actually naming the acting sergeant, Michael Shoemaker, he led me down a path where we were involved in a number of scenarios that were potentially volatile, but he showed the way in which communication was much more valuable than being hands-on, so to speak, using our other tools. And we were able to talk many angry individuals down and take them into custody safely as a consequence of using that skill set. And it's certainly a skill set that you need to develop by being present and listening and taking time, because the language that you use will have an impact on the way in which a scenario plays out. And you only learn that you cannot learn that through a cross-cultural environment in a college environment. You learn that operationally through being involved in the community when you are doing a job as a police officer.
But leadership in that regard is crucial, isn't it? You just gave an example of it from Michael Schumacher.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So if you were advising young officers, you're the sergeant at Yundamu today, and you're advising young officers about how to use your voice commands, what advice do you give?
Speak slowly. Understand. So whether it was intentional or not, I learnt, and I say this to everyone who goes to a remote community, take the time to learn some of the local language, whether it's just simply hello or please or thank you. Those small elements of understanding the local language to show a level of integration and appreciation of the environment within which you're working is extremely important. I've done that at every community that I've ever worked at. So much so that over time at Yundamu, a lot of my language would shift and I would speak more Warlpiri than I understood that I would or did. And it was certainly relevant when I came to town and people would ask, what did I just say? And that was the way in which that I took the opportunities that when I was at Papunya, when I was at Yundamu, and every other community I've ever worked in, I've done exactly the same thing, so that you are a part of the community, not the police officers in that community, if that makes sense, because you are part of that community.
Apart from assisting you in your work, was it also rewarding for you to learn part of some language skills?
It probably was not something I appreciated until I went to Papunya and Yuendamu, the depth and complexity and the richness of what Indigenous culture is, and will continue to be. It didn't dawn upon me until I had the opportunity with an elderly man who was the traditional owner for Yuendamu, who sat me down under a tree and talked me through his life story and when I first got to Yuendamu, and helped me understand some of the cultural nuances that were important to me, and then they were obviously reinforced by the other two Aboriginal community police officers. But that in itself gave me an insight into this is not just another part of society. This is not just another town that's up down the road from Alice Springs. This is unique, and it's steeped in cultural history that, as I say, to this day I know a little bit, but I certainly don't know as much as many others. It was extremely rewarding for me to be able to be a part of that, to be able to learn that information and then be able to pass that on to others, because I've done that with other police that have gone to Yuendamu in the lead up to their arrival. A young man has just moved to Kintore as a police officer from being an Aboriginal community police officer, and I took the opportunity to sit down and speak with him only last week about the things I learnt when I worked at Papunya and Kintore back in the 90s, that those things won't have changed, because the culture won't have changed and the legacy won't have changed.
Did you come to know, as a young man working in Yuendamu in the 90s, about the Coniston massacre? I
did.
How did you learn about that?
I'm not entirely sure how I learnt about it, but I actually went to the site. So where I first learnt about it, but I actually went to the site with one of the Aboriginal community police officers who had died. He took me there. He did not say anything, but he took me to the site. We also visited some other outstations at the time around that area, and I haven't been back since, but I've learnt more about it since that time.
And do you appreciate that the ongoing trauma for the community as a result of that state-sanctioned massacre?
Look, yes, and I didn't appreciate it at the time because it wasn't something that I had been familiar with. But after the fact, I did some research. I had to use the police library because the internet wasn't really a thing back then, to provide me some information to learn about it, and I was quite astounded, to be honest. But to understand why that particular person who took me there didn't say anything, it took me a while to appreciate why, because it was obviously a sad sight for Walpy people to this day.
Do you appreciate that history in Australia can impact on the way that subsequent generations trust police?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know in other communities across the territory where we've had critical incidents such as this, that it takes a long time to rebuild that trust. And that same scenario, it will take time, and many years, a number of years, to be able to do that to the full extent. And to, in fact, it may never be completely resolved, as it is not with the Coniston scenario.
You gave an interesting example in relation to use of force when you were a young officer working with Officer Hand. And I don't do this in any way to be critical of Officer Hand, but can you tell us what happened in that incident?
We were trying to arrest someone, and then that person pulled a knife on me, tried to stab me to avoid apprehension, but we talked our way through it and used community that were there to disarm the man and take him to the police station. So no, we didn't have to use our hands at all.
When you were more senior, I withdraw that. When you were working with Officer Ham, were you more senior or were you the same?
We were the same. We were off the same course, the same vintage, so to speak.
Okay. You effectively said that Officer Ham pulled his firearm. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate because you're saying that's in response to a knife. Is that right?
When I say pulled his firearm, he went to pull his firearm or clipped. He didn't brandish it as such.
Okay, so he went to unclip it.
Yeah, for memory, yeah.
And how at that time, can you recall whether there was distance between yourself and the person who had the weapon?
No, he was right in front of me.
So what did you do?
Yeah, stepped back and then started to engage, and that's an example of using language. We're arresting him for murder, and for an incident that occurred in Alice Springs the day prior. and I'd placed an audio. Back in those days, there was a tape recorder on the roof of the car that he was in to record the apprehension. And unbeknownst to me, he had a knife in his hand beside the door, and he thrust that at my head. And in an attempt to avoid apprehension, obviously I moved, and then we verbalised and engaged and used the community to de-escalate the situation and take him into custody. I actually walked him to the police station from that location.
And has there been any occasion in your career outside of...
ask you, did you put handcuffs on him?
No.
Were the community of assistance then in bringing that person in assisting you to arrest him?
They walked with us to the police station, and they were present when we put him into the cells. So yes, in short.
At any time when you were working there as a young police officer in 97, 98, did you use the ACPO to assist with arrests?
Yes, on multiple occasions.
And do you have a recollection of whether other people in the community, elders, emerging leaders, were used to assist with arrests if the ACPO was unavailable?
Yes, certainly.
Moving on from your time in community, I think you've said in your interview you were the officer in charge of the Southern Division at some point in February 2010 to 2011. Is that right?
Yes.
During that time, I'll just read you what you say about it in your interview. During that time, we had significant riotous behaviour on the back of a homicide that occurred at Walpuri Camp in Alice Springs, where a young person by the name of Kumanjayi Walker was killed by Walpuri people from Yuendumu, and that created significant cultural conflict that lasted in the vicinity of 12 months. Across that period and interspersed with various levels of violence and unrest within the community. So although none of that violence was necessarily directed towards police, that was an issue, and I'll come back to anything directed to police. But during that time, Her Honour understands from material in the brief of evidence that it was very difficult for people in Yuendumu community itself. A number of people in the community, in fact, moved to South Australia for a period of time.
They did.
And there were particular issues then that police had to try and manage because of family upset.
Yes.
Did you actually go into Yuendumu yourself, or were you managing from Alice Springs?
No, I went back to Yuendumu. So I spent time with the individuals who were displaced when they were in Alice Springs in transit to and from Adelaide. And I also spent time in Yuendumu during some of the conflict, trying to assist with managing some of that conflict. I actually took with me during that period the Aboriginal Community Police Officer who I spoke of earlier, who lived at Kintore. I had him come in because he's actually a Walpuri man. He was a Walpuri leader, although he lived in Kintore because he's married a Pindabi woman. And I took another gentleman with me, now whether he was an Aboriginal Community Police Officer at the time or not, from Santa Teresa, Philip Alice, who's still, I believe, in the Northern Territory Police employ as an Aboriginal liaison officer. I took both of those men with me to assist with some of the cultural brokering around the mediation and the reintegration of the displaced group of people who were returning back into the community. So I did spend a lot of time at Yuendumu during that period.
When you use the term riotous behaviour in your interview, what do you mean by that?
Significant conflict that was hallmarked by the use of various weapons to inflict injuries upon parties on either side.
Were you ever there when the TRG was called in?
Yes, I was there at one stage when TRG were in the community, yes.
Were you responsible for requesting the TRG at any stage during that time?
Look, I'm not entirely sure, but I would have been a party to some of the decision making, yes.
At any time back then, so with 2010, was there a cordon and containment group in Alice Springs?
Not to my knowledge, no.
So if you wanted police with particular training in relation to dealing with riots or challenging aggressive behaviour, it was the TRG that you were calling in, a specialist squad?
Look, yes. The scenario would have been such that they would have been there in a general support capacity.
So is it the case then that you don't recall the TRG being called in to break up any riotous behaviour? They were called as backup effectively for general duties?
Look, yes, I recall them being there in a general support capacity, which is part of their function.
Do you recall being involved in, I would draw that, when the TRG were asked to assist General Duties Police in Yuendamu in 2010, was there an operational order or plan that would be developed prior to them coming? And if you, I appreciate it some time ago, if you don't recall, just tell us.
I don't recall the exact detail, but I do recall there being a plan that governed their involvement within that community.
You referred to ACPOs being of assistance in mediation efforts, in effect, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Was there any other agency or assistance brought in to, other than police or ACPOs to help? Police are ACPOs are police, but any external agency?
So what is now Department of Chief Minister and Cabinet were involved in developing a broader mediation program for the Walpre, which it started to evolve and develop then, and I believe it still exists to some extent to this day. And that was about starting that mediation and then maintaining that mediation long term to maintain peace within that community.
Do you recall now some of the elders who were of assistance in mediating disputes?
Look, yes, yes, certainly on sort of both sides of the family groups.
You mentioned earlier, I think Robin Granitz was a particular help to police in the leadership around that.
So Robin and another gentleman who's passed away were part of the group that was displaced, and then on the other side you had the family of the deceased and their leadership group, and then you had other members who weren't directly involved as such, but were cultural leaders and had a voice in that space as well. Some of whom have given evidence to this court already.
Do you include in that Mr. Hargraves?
Ned Hargraves is one.
And was Warren Williams involved in assisting police at that time?
No, I don't believe so. I believed at that time Warren was living at Tea Tree.
Do you agree that it would have been particularly traumatic for children exposed to that fighting at the time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you aware of whether any trauma counselling services were brought in to assist the community?
In 2010?
Yes.
Look, not to my knowledge. It doesn't mean it didn't happen though.
And it might be the same answer to this question, but since that time, to assist families, particularly children, who were subject to trauma during that fighting, has there been any counselling or support services?
No, not to my knowledge, but that doesn't mean it hasn't occurred.
In relation to your experience in Alice Springs, you had that period of time between 2010 to 2011 as the officer in charge of Southern Division. What other experience have you had in a management capacity at Alice Springs?
So after we came back to Alice Springs in 2020, so I was at Northern Boy prior to that. I was in it's now called the Central Desert Division. I was there until May of the following year, to 2021. Then I went back to the officer in charge of criminal investigations. I was in that role for 18 months, I believe. I then was 6 months as the staff officer to the Assistant Commissioner of Regional and Remote Policing, as it was at the time. And then I was promoted to the rank of Superintendent, and I was Alice Springs Division Superintendent for 2 years up until mid-2015. I was then the the Superintendent in charge of the remote region again before we transferred back to Darwin.
I should say, Assistant Commissioner, in your statement, which is dated the 20th of August 2020, you set out in detail your history in the Northern Territory Police Force and the different posts that you've held. So I won't take you through that entirely. But when you left in 2011, you maintained your contact with community members from Yuendamu, you tell Her Honour, and you in fact attended the the funerals of the two ACPOs that you'd worked with?
Yes, so we moved, my family and I moved back to Darwin in 2016, and I attended Kintor for the funeral of one of those men, and then I think it was a year later, I actually went back to Yuendamu on a number of occasions to see one of the other men when he was ill and ailing, to see him and his family. And then when he passed, I took my family, gracious enough, the Commissioner at the time allowed me to take my family to Nirrupi, and where I was again a pallbearer in relation to that funeral and the burial of that particular individual.
What did that mean to you?
Well, there was multiple layers to that. So it showed the ongoing respect that the community had for myself as a person, not as a police officer. And there were lots of other police there. It wasn't just myself. And it shows the power of relationships in that those remote community contexts. It gave my children an opportunity to see that community and see the way in which those relationships were held by that community in relation to me, and how they then the community embraced my children. My children actually participated in the funeral. It was really quite an empowering experience for them as well. And those relationships are ongoing to this day. So I still get phone calls, I still have text messages with the various family members from those family groups, and that communication, not just myself, there's lots of others too, but we maintain that it's a friendship. It's not a police relationship or a professional relationship.
You have worked as a divisional superintendent between July 2013 to 2015, and I'll come back to that shortly. And I want to ask you, though, about a difficult topic. During your experience in Alice Springs, as a young police officer firstly, then out in community, and then back in managerial roles in Alice Springs, you're often interacting with Aboriginal community in difficult circumstances where there are arrests with some members of the community, obviously. For yourself, though, you've told us about some very positive interactions and friendships that you developed. Starting with your time as a young officer, did you ever hear negative racist expressions about Aboriginal people used by police officers?
Look, yes, would be dishonest to say otherwise. There was certainly the odd language that now, upon reflection, was highly inappropriate, but it wasn't widespread. It was, but it did occur when I first arrived in Alice Springs. Certainly, when I went to remote communities. So, as a police officer in Alice Springs, you're dealing reactionary to alcohol-fueled incidents within the community on a daily basis, ongoing. It wasn't until I went to a remote community that I was able to deal with Indigenous people in their community in a time when they weren't at their lowest ebb, that I had the opportunity to get that broader cultural appreciation of what it meant to be a Warlpiri person or a Lurutja or a Pindabi person. Didn't experience that language when I was in those remote communities, and I didn't really experience that language much after I left, or if at all, after I left Yuendamu and moved to Darwin. But there certainly was pockets of it occasionally when I was a young constable.
I want to ask you particularly about your time as a divisional superintendent between July 2013 and 2015. You understand, don't you, that MFIC, we have a document which reveals some text exchanges between Constable Rolfe and other officers, including a sergeant who was working within the Southern Division, and they revealed the use of terms like referring to Aboriginal people, bushcoons, niggers, Neanderthals and grubby fucks. This is 2019, that language is being used. Did you hear that language when you were the superintendent working in Alice Springs in 2013 to 2015, directed to Aboriginal people by police?
Look, no, I didn't. But if I had been aware of it, we would have done something to address that language.
What would you have done if you'd heard a police officer in your station refer to Aboriginal people using the term niggers or bushcoons?
Well, that's not who we are as an agency. It's not who we were as an agency then. It goes to the heart of who we are as the Northern Territory Police. That language undermines the culture of being a police officer in this agency and what it means to wear this uniform. If that language was made apparent to myself and my team, we would have dealt with it. I mean, obviously, if there's a disciplinary pathway, but it's more than that. It's about the culture and the impact that was having on those individuals and why they were using that language, and get to the heart of where that language comes from and why it's even being utilised in that whatever context it was being used in. And that would have been the most appropriate way of going about managing that, because it could be about the individual, it could be about their own personal biases, or it could be a reaction to something they've been exposed to that they may have required support in relation to some welfare concerns potentially. It could have been a whole raft of reasons. So, but if we had have known about it, it's not something that we would have ignored. It would have needed to be addressed, as it would need to be addressed now if that became apparent to us.
What do you say to someone in the community or in the police force who says, look, it's just people letting off steam, doesn't mean anything?
No, I don't accept that at all. I didn't accept it previously. I don't accept it now. It's indicative of someone's personal biases toward a cultural group that hasn't the ability to impact on their ability to do their job, a job that we must do without fear or favour and objectively. And you cannot have that language seeping into the workplace or in the private context. It doesn't matter, because it has the ability to influence your ability to do your job.
Do you think that the use of racist language can lead to dehumanising people who you might have to interact with?
Of course.
And that could lead to decisions being made about use of force that are inappropriate?
Potentially.
If an officer use that language, and you say you would have to get to the bottom of why that language was being used. What do you say about the fact that that language appears to have been used by a sergeant who was himself in a leadership role?
Well, that's extremely disappointing, because the rank of sergeant is, in my view, the most important rank in the police force, because it is the position that is the representative of the Commissioner 24/7 in all frontline operational policing contexts across the Northern Territory. And that person is responsible for shaping and developing the minds of all our young police officers. They are supervisors, they are leaders, they are mentors. And to hear that coming from a sergeant, it's extremely disappointing.
Do you agree, Assistant Commissioner, that to understand that language, well, I would draw that if it's revealed that that language comes from a sergeant, there should be some form of discipline that is applied fairly swiftly once it's revealed?
The matter needs to be dealt with appropriately. Now, whether that's discipline or some other form of appropriate sanction would be relevant to the context at the time.
Certainly needs to be addressed quickly.
Addressed. Yes.
I want to ask you now about the development of the Cordon and Containment Group and what subsequently became, as we understand it, the IRT. In your statement from August 2020, you say at paragraph 12, I was exposed to the deployment. I would draw that, I'll go back a step. In paragraph 11, when you worked as the divisional superintendent between 2013 to 2015, you say you commenced the development in Alice Springs of a rudimentary capacity to provide enhanced cordon and containment capability. Was there any cordon and containment at all when you started there in 2013 in that role?
Look, no, and I probably should place some clarity around that paragraph. It may be that it existed at times prior to that, so I didn't develop it as such. I was aware after there was an exercise, a training exercise delivered in Alice Springs, that if we were to, for example, be confronted by a counter-terrorism type scenario in Alice Springs, we had frontline officers, investigators, and then we would have to wait for specialist resources from Darwin to be deployed. And it was that gap in between that sort of led to the concept of reinvigorating cordon and containment as a concept, and that was to provide, exactly as the term suggests, cordon off an area, contain a potential offender until specialist resources were available to assist more broadly in relation to that particular matter. So that's what we went about developing.
Was it ever intended that the cordon and containment team would be responsible for high-risk arrests?
Look, no, not in my understanding at that time.
You are aware that the team ultimately came to be known as the Incident Response Team, or IRT, and you say at paragraph 12 you were exposed to their deployment when you were the Acting Assistant Commissioner of Crime at in Darwin, is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell Her Honour about that?
So I became aware through a joint management committee meeting in relation to a response to a suspicious death at Ali Kurrung. I believe it was Operation Charlotte it was called. And through that committee meeting, there was some talk about general support being provided into the community by the IRT, as it were, the Incident Response Team. That was the first time I'd heard that language. I believe that was 2017, but my statement would confirm that.
There's just one matter that before that time, in your interview, you say at page 30 in 2015, before IRT, when I was in Alice Springs with a small group of people that we had, I do recall sending them to apprehend someone near Rabbit Flat, and you recall Officer Lee Bowens and Officer Luke Bevan being involved, and they assisted Yuendamu Police in apprehending someone. Was that something that you were involved in deployment of the IRT, or I withdraw that of cordon and contain? Or?
I don't know whether I was directly involved in their deployment, but I'm certainly aware that they were tasked specifically to assist Yuendamu with that particular apprehension.
Do you recall the development of any general orders in relation to the cordon and containment team?
I know it was being developed as I transitioned out of the Alice Springs superintendent role, and I understand it's since been a standing operating procedure since been developed after I'd left the role.
Were you involved at all in the standard operating procedures for the IRT?
No.
Had you seen them at any time prior to the 9th of November?
No, I hadn't.
Can I come now then, Officer, to the incident on the 6th of November? On the 6th of November 2019, can you just remind us what your substantive position was?
So I was the acting assistant. My substantive position was Commander of Darwin, but I was the acting Assistant Commissioner for Regional and Road Policing as it was at the time.
You came to be aware of an incident in Yuendamu where 2 police officers were involved in attempting to arrest Kumanjayi, is that right? And there was an axe incident as it has come to be known.
So I received an email on I believe that was a Wednesday. On the Thursday or Friday, I received an email. I actually don't recall which day. And that email came to me from Commander Brad Curry, who was the Southern Command Commander, that provided some context around the welfare concerns as a result of that particular matter, and a brief indication around the ongoing attempts to take the person involved into custody. When I received that email, I sent an email to Senior Constable Chris Hand as a welfare check on him, given that he was involved in that particular incident.
I'll just read to you the email that you sent. It's attached as an annexure to your statement of the 20th of August 2020. You write to him at 11:52 a.m. after finding out about that incident, "You all right? I see the Walpreys with the surname of Walker are still ours and my nemesis, Travis." Firstly, why did you send that email? It's Thursday, the 7th of November.
Well, it was a welfare check, as I said, to Senior Constable Hand. I must assist the court by explaining the word nemesis. It's an extremely poor choice of words. However, when Senior Constable Hand and I were at Yuendamu, there were a group of men with a surname Walker, who were all Walprey men. There were 5, and they were such that we had lots and lots of interactions with them, some of which were violent, and many of which required them being apprehended for various things at various times. And that happened consistently throughout our entire time at Yuendamu, and they were a challenging group of people to deal with because of the violence that they were capable of.
When you wrote that, the word nemesis, you've just said it was a poor choice of words. Did you mean any offence by it?
No, it was just to suggest that that surname was a surname that was synonymous with some of the time that we'd spent at Yuendamu around our interactions.
Chris Hand writes back to you, "Hey mate, yeah, I'm good, thanks. Getting too old for this stuff, ha ha. The same family names keep popping up, just the younger ones now. The people we dealt with are too old to fight us. I don't think he wanted to chop us up. He just wanted to escape. No one was injured, and that's the best result in my view. I trust all is well with you, Chris." Did you question that in any way when he said to you, "I don't think he wanted to chop us up, he just wanted to escape"? That makes sense to you?
Look, it does, because that was the way in which Chris and I conducted ourselves at Yuendamu, so that made sense. From memory, I don't think I even replied to his email.
He then says, "No one was injured, and that's the best result in my view." Did you agree with that?
Oh, of course, no one got harmed.
Did you watch the body-worn video at any stage at that time?
Not at that time. I didn't see the body-worn video until after the incident on the 9th of November.
Do you recall having any further discussion with Officer Hand at any time between the 7th of November and the death of Kumanjayi on the 9th?
I did have contact with Senior Constable Hand prior to the passing of Kumanjayi Walker on that particular night.
It was after he'd been shot, is that right?
Correct.
But do I take it from that exchange that you were satisfied, you did a welfare check on Officer Hand, you were satisfied from his response that that his welfare was under control?
Yes.
And you didn't think that there was any further follow-up required?
Well, noting that earlier in that email it talks about the fact that the Southern Command management team were providing welfare support to those people at Yuendamu in any case.
Your next involvement, I think, in what occurred subsequently was a phone conversation that took place between yourself and Superintendent Nobbs at 1:51 p.m. on the 9th of November, correct?
Correct.
Why was it that he was calling you at that time?
So, in the position that I held at the time, ordinarily I wouldn't be the point of contact, but the commander, so Commander Brad Curry, who's the commander for Southern Command, was taking a night away from the community, and he was away with his family, so he contacted me sometime prior to that and asked if it was okay if I would be the point of contact for his team, to which I agreed. And it was in that context that I received that call from Superintendent Nobbs.
Where were you at the time?
I was in Darwin. Where I actually was, to this day I've racked my brain, I cannot tell you where I was. I certainly wasn't at home and I wasn't at work.
I see. You weren't rostered on that day? Is that
No, I
right?
wasn't, no.
So you were effectively taking that phone call because you offered to be on call for Commander Curry, is that right?
In essence, yes.
When you got the phone call from the superintendent, you had a conversation about a number of things, and you set this out in your statement. It's not a memory test, Assistant Commissioner, and would it assist you to refer to your statement to tell Her Honour what information was passed on to you by the Superintendent at the time?
Oh, look, I can have a go at it. And then, so the conversation that we had lasted for about 9 minutes. And in that conversation, Superintendent Nobbs suggested that the police at Yuendumu required respite. There were only 2 police officers in that community providing community policing services, that being Sergeant Julie Frost and Senior Constable Chris Hand. In that same conversation, Superintendent Nobbs advised that there'd been a number of property-related matters that occurred that impacted on health, staff, properties, premises, dwellings, cars, and there was a suggestion, although there was no evidence to support it, that it may have involved Kumanjayi Walker. Kumanjayi Walker was still believed to be in the community, and he was at large in relation to a breach of suspended sentence and the incident that occurred on the 6th of November that we've just heard about. There was a funeral that was to take place that day, and that there was an arrangement that post that funeral that the community would surrender Kumanjayi Walker to police in relation to those matters. And there was a requirement, so the health staff had either had left or were planning on leaving the community, and the request was around providing additional support and respite to the 2 police officers in the community to provide reassurance to the health staff to encourage them either to return or to remain in the community. And to do that, we required additional police presence. In that conversation, Superintendent Nobbs indicated that he was suggesting that members of the IRT be utilised, not because they were IRT members, but because they were more inclined to respond to a call for extra duty to assist the police at Yuendumu. And it was for that reason he suggested that those members be utilised. So members of the IRT as opposed to the IRT itself. He also suggested that a dog operations handler and his dog also be deployed to assist in that general support capacity as well.
The plan effectively, or what he was telling you, was twofold, wasn't it, in terms of why those officers were required?
Yes.
One was support for the existing Yuendumu police to give them some respite.
Yes.
But there was also a way of to assist to develop a plan to bring Kumanjayi into custody.
Yes, that's correct. So if there was additional support within the community to provide that community safety policing component, that would allow the sergeant then to focus on developing that plan around the safe custodial arrangements for Kumanjayi Walker.
So Superintendent Nobbs was calling you to have this conversation. Was he actually asking for your permission to send in additional members? That is, did you have to approve that?
So if we were looking at the deployment of the IRT as the IRT, yes, because within the standard operating procedure in relation to that team, the level of approval was either commander or the territory duty superintendent. If it was just members of the general duties workforce, that didn't require the level of commander for that level of approval.
This was an odd hybrid, wasn't
Yes.
it? Because it was the members of the IRT, but in fact not being deployed as the IRT.
And Superintendent Nobbs, I would suggest, was just being very diligent in the execution of that particular role, because he was asking for members of the IRT, and technically, if that's the way in which that was to be played out, then it required commander approval.
And I would draw that. Had you ever had any experience where cordon and containment or IRT had been sent in as general duties rather than as they were intended?
Well, look, I hadn't had any experience in it, but that's the general support role, and that's a role not dissimilar to the role that TRG could take up. And it's simply, they're all frontline officers or from an investigative team, and they're all trained as police officers first and foremost, and they all have the skill to be frontline police officers.
When the is there ever a situation where TRG are asked to attend a community in a general support role rather than for a TRG purpose?
Yeah, absolutely, and I've been involved in many occasions where that's been the case.
In those circumstances, what rank has to approve the TRG going into a community?
I believe that's Assistant Commissioner.
And that would be the case regardless of whether they were going in to assist general duties or for a specific plan?
Yes, their deployment is governed under their particular general order. It's very specific in relation to their deployment.
Have you been involved in approving the TRG going into a community?
I've been involved in deploying the TRG, but whether it was to a remote community or not, I'm unsure. But I certainly have been involved in the deployment, the approval process.
When you are involved in the deployment of the TRG, would you be involved in the operational order?
No.
Who would develop am I using the right terminology in terms of the paperwork that's done to set out the plan?
That is appropriate terminology, yes.
Who, at what level, what rank does the operational plan?
It can be developed by people of any rank, really, but it certainly requires superintendent and commander endorsement, depending on the nature of what that is. If it's developed rapidly, then its level of it may not be a full written document, is sort of what I'm getting at, if it's having to be developed rapidly. If it's a full written document, it may have approval, signed written approval.
You were, I think you told us earlier, you weren't involved in developing any standard operating orders for the IRT, and you had not, in fact, had reason to read them prior to the 9th of November. Is that right?
Correct.
Did you anticipate that there would be an operational plan for the IRT going out to assist with general duties?
No. But I understood a plan was being developed in relation to the apprehension of Walker.
Who did you think was developing that plan?
The staff at Yondamu.
Did you think that the IRT were in any way going to be involved in the arrest of Kumanjayi?
Or not during that phone call at 1:51. My understanding was they were going out to provide that community-based support in relation to that criminal activity around the health staff premises.
Were you concerned that the health clinic staff had moved out of the community?
Very. So it's an extremely important function for Yondamu, for any community for that matter, that knowing full well the health issues that exist in remote communities, the health staff are communities extremely reliant on the health staff to provide that support into a community, and if they are not there, then the community is vulnerable.
At any time when you were in Yondamu or Papunya, had clinic staff moved out of the community in response to concerns?
No.
And were you aware of clinic staff moving out of community at any occasion, even when you're not working there, because of concerns?
Look, I am aware of it being spoken of, and I do recall some issues at a community called Numbawa, but we talked through that with the clinic management, and we were able to work through the scenario so that that service was maintained within that community.
When you were speaking with Superintendent Nobbs, was it in your mind that they needed to get the clinic staff back into the community as soon as possible?
When I was speaking to Superintendent Nobbs, he was unsure whether they had actually left or they were about to leave. But either way, to give them the reassurance that their safety was assured, we require that additional policing support into the community to actually provide that reassurance, to ensure that service could be maintained, or if they had already left, have that service return.
Am I right that when you were having that discussion with Superintendent Nobbs about around 1:50 to 2 p.m, there was at that stage no arrest plan for Kumanjayi?
Look, so if you go back to the email that Brad Curry had sent, it was clear that there was some loose plan around using Derek Williams or family to have him handed in. I'm aware that the funeral was supposed to be on on Friday, and it was postponed to Saturday. So I don't recall the detail of what the plan was that Superintendent Nobbs may have provided to me, if at all, but I was aware that there was a plan being developed that was based around his negotiated surrender.
And did you believe that Derek Williams would be involved in his negotiated surrender?
So I understood Derek was coming back on shift the following day, the Sunday, and in my mind, it was going to occur when he was on shift.
Did anybody actually tell you that?
I'm unsure whether that occurred with a conversation with Superintendent Nobbs or not, but that's just my recollection.
You specifically recall a discussion with Superintendent Nobbs about the fact that there was a funeral and the arrest would take place after the funeral, correct?
Yes.
Given your experience in community, you understand that funerals don't necessarily last just an afternoon or a day.
No. So they're a culturally significant event for the Walpering, for the relevant family groups. They're not defined by time. This is a perfect example that it was delayed from the Friday to the Saturday. They don't start at a defined point in time, and they'll go for as long as required to ensure that whatever culturally appropriate processes that need to occur, and that can take some time.
So when you were told that the plan was to wait until after the funeral, did you think that that it was appropriate, and in terms of cultural sensitivities, to wait for however long it took for that funeral to finish?
Look, absolutely. I didn't understand whether that person was involved in the funeral or not, but that's not necessarily relevant. It's more about the community and the police-community relationship.
You recall that there was a discussion about Superintendent Nobbs wanted a patrol dog handler and a dog to be deployed?
Yes.
Why was that?
So, as I understood it, was about that community safety aspect, specifically around the property crime that had occurred that had impacted on the health staff, and that is what led to their fear and apprehension at that point in time, and that was another tool available to us to create that community reassurance.
So at that time you believed that the dog and dog handler were going out in terms of general duty support, is that right?
Yes.
Nothing to do with the arrest of Kumanjayi?
No.
During your discussion with Superintendent Nobbs, was there any discussion about the type of weapons that the IRT members would carry?
No.
Did you believe that they would take anything other than their general accoutrements for general duties?
Oh, that was my expectation, but I didn't actually have a conversation with Superintendent Nobbs about that.
So you did not think that they would carry their IRT gear, which is the AR-15s and the other long arms?
So no. So what I was approving was members of the IRT who were all general duties members to attend to assist at UNDMO. In my mind, I wasn't deploying the IRT for an IRT function.
Do you think it would have been appropriate at that time to deploy the IRT in an IRT function on the basis of the information that you had?
Well, possibly.
If it had been raised with you, well, I withdraw that, what would justify the deployment of the IRT?
If there was a... So the way in which the conversation with Superintendent Nobbs and I transpired was in my mind the undertaking of a risk assessment in relation to that scenario. And I wasn't provided any information during that conversation that provided me with anything other than the need for additional frontline staff. If additional information was provided, then it may have justified a specific deployment, but that wasn't the request that was put to me.
And there's no justification, is there, for general duties police to be carrying beanbag rounds and long arms, is there?
No.
You wouldn't expect for general duties AR-15s to be carried around in the community?
No.
Do you accept that for community members in Yuendamu, seeing police that they are unfamiliar with carrying long arm rifles would be frightening?
It certainly would have been confronting, yes.
And that in the absence of any rioting behaviour, that would be confusing
I would assume so, yes.
and could serve to undermine the levels of trust that the community members have in police?
Potentially, yes.
And it would create a level of apprehension, wouldn't it, that community members wouldn't know why police were there and what they were going to do?
Yeah, correct.
So can I suggest to you, Assistant Commissioner, that it was wholly inappropriate for members of the IRT who'd been deployed in a general duties capacity to be walking around the community of Yuendamu after a funeral carrying long arm weapons? Do you agree?
It wasn't appropriate, no.
Your Honour, is that a convenient time to break? I'm about to move on to a different topic.
Yes, we'll take the about.
Hey, Peggy, how much longer have you got?